Welcome to the Connected Enterprise Podcast. This is Carl Lewis, your host from Vision33. And my guest today is Paul DuBois from a company called Appenate. Paul, welcome.
Thank you. Pleased to be here.
Hey, before we get started on just our usual Q&A, tell us about yourself and about your company and what you guys do and where you're from, all that good stuff.
Yeah, sure. So I'm based in Australia, in a city called Brisbane, which everyone knows about Sydney and Melbourne, but we're the third biggest ones. So Brisbane is where I've called home for about the last 15 years. Prior to that, I lived in and was born in South Africa. So I've made the move across, but still in the Southern Hemisphere. So yeah, the company itself, I founded it about 10 years ago. And really it was founded out of what I saw as a need for doing documentation on mobile devices. At that point in time, the iPhone had obviously come out and Android was getting going and all those sorts of things. So it was kind of fairly early in the mobile device sort of revolution that was happening. For me, it was just a case of there's heaps of paper lying around in pretty much any organization. And can't we do this a little easier than having to deal with all of this in sitting on the front seat of your truck?
Hey, before we go any further, I've got to ask, is that actually a Seattle Seahawks hat?
Yep, that is. I'm a Seahawks fan.
A Seahawks fan, all right.
Yeah. I've had a few opportunities to go out to Seattle, and I guess I just latched onto them as a team. You don't really find many NFL fans in Australia. We like our sports down here, but I follow the NFL and the Seahawks in particular. So
excellent. Well, that'll make all my friends in the Pacific Northwest very happy. So they're most of them are Seahawks fans. So by far. So Paul, we always talk about technology on the podcast and about what people are doing. Now, what I found really interesting about what you do is this focus on apps and really helping people do what they do, where they do it, with on a handheld mobile device. And that those apps, I looked at like the collection of apps that you guys have, and you have a platform that people can make their own apps and all kinds of things. What really makes an app as opposed to a full-blown application?
That's a great question. I think the word app is probably like the most abused word in the tech world these days, and has been for a long time. When we're going back to when I started up the company, to me, the word app as opposed to application really meant a kind of cut down version of a full-blown application. So I know you guys work with SAP, so we take SAP as an example, right? SAP will have its different modules, financials, etc. What I think we sort of do is sort of fill the gap where you've got a need to plug into a bigger application that's running really the whole business. You don't have the developers to do it, you don't have the time, but you might have a business person who knows the business process inside and out. And really the need is quite small in terms of the overall number of screens that need to be involved and the amount of data it's involved and so on. But it's a critical process because it feeds into the bigger machine that is the application. With that platform, we've gone that kind of no code route. We were doing the no code thing before no code was a name. And so, that's really where we fit in. And that's, for me, the definition of the word app. But it just depends on who you talk to, right? I mean, app can mean anything these days.
Now, if I remember right, you kind of got started in this area, kind of in the mining field. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. In a previous life, I was the CTO for a kind of small to medium ERP company based out of Australia. And we had customers predominantly in the resources industries. So mining, oil and gas, that sort of stuff, as well as utilities and construction. So I had the privilege of being able to go out to some of these sites and see how they're operated, and I guess see the software that I was, for the company I was working for in action. So I have a connection and affinity with that. And I think also in Australia, we're very safety conscious. So there's a lot of like safety paperwork that you have to go through to do things here. Definitely compared to some states in the US. Sometimes we look at the US and we go, they can do things a lot quicker and easier because there's just less things to sign, right? The safety side of things is also, kind of deeply ingrained as far as my background,
What were some of the things that you noticed early on in terms of, how people were having to do things with, carrying around buckets of paper with them, like you were saying, in their truck and whatnot? Give us an example of one of the simple things that, occurred to you right away that you could really help people with.
pretty much a checklist, right? Any kind of checklist. In the mining industry, there are a lot of checklists. If you just take the safety side of things, particularly in Australia, every mine site actually generally has its own sort of safety regimen. So while there are standardized frameworks and methodologies for performing your safety checklists, inspections, and audits and things like that, the way it works in Australia is every mine site, the kind of head of each mine site is held personally liable if there are safety issues. So every single person who's in charge of a mine site here is sort of incentivized to make sure that they can prove that they've done everything they can if there is a safety incident. So you end up with all these kind of, you have a baseline kind of framework and then all these little variants almost on a per mine site basis. And so when I saw that and I saw that the paperwork that comes with that, to me, it was, you can't just build a one size fits all for those situations, right? You need to give the user or the customer latitude to be able to make changes to the application. And that's kind of where it led me down this idea of, let's make it easy for people to build custom apps that will plug into that larger application.
And your platform that you guys work with, I mean, people are obviously using these types of applications and then feeding information into their ERP or whatever data source that could be. It has APIs and all those things that a modern application would have, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So we've got the REST API. I started writing the first code, I'd say about 10 years ago. So at that point, cloud and everything was already happening, and it was obvious that's where things were going. But obviously, again, I guess just due to my background, I had seen plenty of enterprises where they'd set up their own data centers, or they'd invested a lot into their own networks, essentially. And so to me, there was always going to be a hybrid need where cloud probably fits most organizations, and it's a great choice. I think it's definitely, to me, having someone manage the security, especially, is a major plus just by itself, aside from the scalability benefits and so on. But you're also always going to have a group of companies, probably on the government and the larger enterprise side, where it makes sense for them to have their own investments in infrastructure. And so they'll want to host on their own infrastructure. So the platform's been designed to interoperate, through REST APIs, JSON or XML, as well as built-in connectors that we keep adding to the platform for different types of storage services and so on. And ultimately, it can run in our cloud, which we run off Azure, Microsoft Azure, but it can run on AWS. It can run inside your own data center. Hell, it can run in a box, under your desk if you're so inclined. But I would hope none of our customers are doing that these days.
Just need some nostalgia, right? You would get.
Yeah. I remember the old the freaking Windows Server SBS boxes, that yes, every little organization would have in a closet somewhere, running their email and all that stuff. Seems like a lifetime ago.
It does. I remember whole rooms, with raised floors and air conditioning and, a lot of noise inside of that room. So we've come through quite a number of generations when it comes to servers, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
But it sounds like you are seeing most of the organizations choose a cloud solution these days. Would that be the case?
Yeah, I think so. The funny thing though is I think these things go around in cycles, just like fashion and so on. So, cloud is becoming, just like the word app, it's becoming such a kind of loaded word. So I would say, the kind of small to medium-sized customers that we have will generally just take our public cloud offering, which, as I said, is hosted off Azure. But the more we work with enterprises, in particular, larger enterprises, the more we're seeing this kind of fragmentation where, you've got enterprises who are running multi-cloud because they want to have the redundancy. So if Azure, goes down, they can stand up something on Google Cloud or something like that. The nature of like security requirements and so on, particularly in certain industries, is such that you're always going to have this need to kind of control the lower stack, the networking stack and so on to some degree with certain industries and certain size companies. So yeah, but cloud is definitely the biggest. It's just we're seeing cloud in multitude of directions, I guess, as we work with bigger companies.
Yeah, well, a lot of hybrid approaches is
yes.
That's never going to leave. I think you and I agree on that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So if I can have you put on your look into the future hat here, what do you think? What's out there? What's happening in the world of technology that's going to have an impact on your business in the next 3 to 5 years. You were, 10 years ago, it sounds like you were a person who, when they started talking about cloud, you believed in it and you started investing. If you were going to do that again today, what would you be looking at doing?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a crystal ball. The tech industry is changing and moving pretty fast. I think we're in a kind of consolidation stage right now where, the cloud providers are pretty clear who they are. And to me, if we talk purely about the hosting infrastructure and so on, I think Microsoft's already moving in this direction, but I can see there being opportunities for new providers to come in. And that is really this kind of, I think the buzzword is like edge centers, right? So having data centers that are much closer to you, to your individual city, even, that sort of thing. I think seeing hosting become almost more localized, but still through a cloud-based approach is something that I expect to happen. And, it makes sense for a lot of reasons, particularly around latency and so on. But I think also then it gives you protection against issues, right? Because at the moment, we've got these enormous monolithic data centers, in one place that's hosting, multiple states around it or countries. I think the more we see these kind of localized edge centers, the better it is from a redundancy perspective, right? Because it's less likely, if something happens, you're less likely to be affected, unless it's, some really global thing. But the mobile space is really, really fun at the moment because, again, things are kind of settled down, but there's a lot of new stuff that we're still really trying to figure out how to use. I think the AR side of things is really interesting. I think augmented reality, as opposed to the full, Oculus thing, is I think where it's the most accessible of the kind of R's, you would say, alternative realities. And I think in a business context, it makes a lot of sense. So, one of the things we're looking at the moment is, can we provide just some simple tools inside the app that, would be like a drag on field that allows you to do a measurement, of between 2 points with AR. Now you can do that. There's demo apps and so on about it. We want to obviously just kind of commoditize that and make that just a field that you can add on any form that you build in our app. So that's the kind of direction, we're looking at. And that's just right now, but I'm really interested to see where AR goes. I think with the mixture of, the other technologies that kind of support the AR experience, I can see vision becoming a lot smarter. And, I'm talking more about camera vision through your phone, not the HoloLens thing is cool. I just can't see people, like whole workforces walking around with the whole full on kit on their head. Yeah.
Not everybody wants a helmet. Yeah.
Yeah, the helmet, exactly, right? Like it's the same as Google Glass. It was a really interesting concept, but you look like an idiot, right? So there's that aesthetic and wearability aspect, I think. Whereas if you can just hold your phone up, and use your camera to assess something and maybe get a lot more data than you currently get from that image. As I said, measurements is just a really simple example, but I could see that going in a lot more directions, being able to see person's heart rate or, that sort of thing, just purely from a particular camera view.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. You're kind of touching on what I think is my next question, which is, I'm with you. I think that's a really interesting area for the future. It's fascinating, but there's not a lot of examples of a real life use.
Yeah.
What do you think is going to be the hardest part about people actually, really utilizing this technology in the future? What's going to be the big challenge?
I mean, I think we've got enough historical examples to kind of show us. Nobody really liked to touch a screen and do things until really, the sort of iPod, iPhone revolution came along. We'll give credit to Apple, but it was also just a nexus of technology that kind of all got to the same point where it allowed that experience to be halfway decent. And I think that's kind of the problem right now is we have a lot of words floating around in space. Like AI is, to me, it's really interesting, but we haven't even figured out how to make it usable yet, really. Google just did their latest Android sort of preview, and it's the latest thing on that is like, it's a personal assistant, right? But it was a personal assistant 5 years ago. It's just a little better every year. So I think we're still trying to figure out how to get to grips with that stuff. And that's why I kind of come back to the AR side of things, because I think that is the most intuitive for a regular person or someone who's trying to just get a job done in the field. They don't want to fiddle around with, have I given it all the right inputs and stuff? They want to be able to hold up their phone, get what they need, and move on with the job, right? And we try to make that possible with the apps that people can build, within our platform. There's lots of work still to do on that, though, and it's the same with all these new technologies. It's how is it going to be accessible to ordinary people, as opposed to the science experiments that a lot of them are still.
That's always been my feeling about that, is that a lot of the illustrations that we see are kind of experiments that maybe somebody did in a research lab, a college, university setting, and it's fascinating. But it's like, okay, how could I use that in business, right? How could I use that in my personal life? And it seems that there's an evolution of time that has to go by before that occurs. I remember the first time a customer ever said to me, I want my guys in the warehouse to be able to capture their time about a job, but I don't want them to have to use a keyboard. Mm-hmm. And so we wrote an application with a touch sensitive screen. At the time, I didn't even know there were touch sensitive screens, right? And so now it's like that's almost the standard, for a lot of people when they buy a laptop, especially. And so it's become commonplace, right, to have that. And the same with touchscreen phones. I think I was probably still using a Kyocera phone at that point in time, right? So things have changed so rapidly over the last 15 years that I wonder how long this change is going to take. I may not be working by the time this actually comes to be, but I'm sure it ends up impacting everyone's lives, right? It just as soon as people sort of catch it and it's really there and they've really got some working examples, then it explodes. So I'll be curious to see how many of those types of situations happen and how fast they happen, for sure. So and that's the case with any kind of pervasive technology shift. I think is it has to kind of make sense very quickly. I mean, I had an Ericsson P800 like touch screen phone with like the fold-up thing. It was like a brick. And I loved that thing. It had a stylus and it was like, this is the future, right? And I don't know, 3 years later, the iPhone popped up and it was instantly obvious that what I had was obsolete, and I think that's the issue with a lot of these. AR is looking really interesting. AI, there's so many potential things that it can do it. We have a company in Brisbane in our sort of tech space here who are using AI to predict prostate cancer from simple assessments of blood work and things like that. It's very, very interesting. And so I think there's heaps of potential there. It's just, it hasn't got to the point where we can look at it and go, you know what, that makes perfect sense. We should use it right now or have it. We need this, and it's just not there yet. So on the way. So part of the journey. So Paul, in these pandemic days, I mean, how has your organization, people you're working with outside the organization, how has communication changed over this period of time for you and your company?
We were set up to be a remote company from the start. So everyone works from home or occasionally from co-working spaces and so on. We don't have an office like officially. We have a place that we can meet and things like that if we need to. So when the pandemic came around, it was kind of business as usual for us internally. But what was really interesting, I think, was more how much the pandemic made it obvious that we need to make sure our people can still connect with like real humans in real time and real space. We've got great video. We're very comfortable with video conferencing and all those sorts of things. We've been remote from day one for 10 years. So we've got our own ways of doing things and so on. But I think what it highlighted to me was as everyone was getting locked away and there wasn't that opportunity to just go out and have a coffee, for example, with someone, we could see the impact on our people. And we're fully remote. So I can imagine how hard it was for companies that are used to working out of an office with everyone in the same space where you can look over the desk and, say hello to someone or ask them a question, or just see if they're there, right? So, we'd solved some of those problems, but we also, we definitely saw the impact of the pandemic in terms of just the separation. And so for us, what we've taken out of the pandemic is very much trying to be a lot more intentional about setting up meets within the cities that we have people in. We have like fortnightly virtual coffees, as we call them, where it's basically just a big Zoom hangout where we hang out and just talk about whatever. We don't talk business. It's like a water cooler, I guess you could say, for a half hour. And then we also have intentional in-person meets every month now. So it's like, we'll pay for coffee, go somewhere, everybody go to that's in the location or the area, and hang out, and do some work. They'll take their laptops, they'll do some work out of the place, but it's more about being connected. So we've become a lot more intentional about that.
I found that interesting about you guys, because many of the businesses that I work with, they weren't remote, and so their big struggle was how to get there.
Yeah.
And they, like you said, their scramble from a professional perspective was, we're not with each other, so how do we work virtually? The frustrations have been because they don't have those relationships in the office, right?
Yeah,
happening in real time. But even after that, once the remote, you still weren't having those. You still, needed ways to associate, and everything was, some places completely closed down, so people didn't have any contact with basically anyone outside of their house, right?
Yeah.
Other than maybe if you went to the grocery store, but that became mechanical, right? I got to go get the food, get out, go home, right? There was no, human banter, interaction. Everything had sort of a scientific, timing to it, right?
Yeah.
You were more of a hurry to get through the store and out the door than ever before. So I think a lot of people found that our lives lost the casual piece, right, about it. Everything became a function of necessity rather than casually, I can get this done. And that you guys kind of noticed that more so once the pandemic happened, even though you'd always been remote, was like, it was just very interesting to me that suddenly became apparent, because they couldn't pursue that other ways. And so you made ways for that to happen, which is a clever on your part, for sure.
Necessary.
Yeah, necessary. I like that.
Yeah, necessity is the mother of invention, or whatever.
Yeah. You obviously work with a lot of different companies, helping them design these apps and helping them deploy them, get the most out of them. What do you think is the hardest part about a customer engaging with your business to get this done?
Look, my favorite saying when talking to customers, especially if you're talking about a fairly large, sort of project where there's a lot of bits and pieces in it, it's really easy to get lost in the tech and go, right, we need to learn how to use this platform. We need to be able to, we've got all our requirements documents. We need to push all this out. We need to get this done. I always sort of say, I think the tech is the easy part. And I mean, look, there are other platforms like ours. Obviously, I'm biased towards ours. I think we make it as easy as we can, but also give a ton of power to users. But what we do see and try and steer customers away from is kind of getting wrapped up in that and going, wow, I can do all these things, right? And it's great and it's empowering. But really the biggest thing with a rollout of apps, especially if it's the first time and the company is very paper orientated, it's the people problem that you've really got to focus on. I've seen projects really across my career, not just within the mobile space, but just where a new application has come in and we've done a great job of implementing, we've done a great job of training and helping the customer really, squeeze everything they can out of that software. And it falls flat because the end users are kind of an afterthought. They get like a training manual thrown at their face and told, right, from Monday, you're using this thing. And it's not a good experience. And for me, it sucks. As someone who writes software and still likes writing code, I don't write code because I write code for two reasons. I write code because I like solving technical problems. That's just one side of my brain. But the other reason I write code is because I want it to be used and I want it to actually add value, right? I don't want it to be something that people loathe using, right? And I mean, I'm sure there's parts of our system still that suck to use, right? And, we're always trying to make it better. But I've just seen a lot of cases where the tech and everything's been great and the people involved, it's all been awesome. And then the rollout to the actual people who are going to use that app every day just falls apart. And it usually falls apart, I think, for a couple of reasons. The first one is there's no phases to it. It's often just a sort of big bang rollout. As I said, they throw a training manual over the fence. to the, I don't know, the road maintenance team, and they say, right, you guys from Monday are using this app. You need to follow the guides and use the applications to do your job. What they've done is they've put this whole new thing in the middle of their workflow, and they haven't stopped to think, okay, what's the actual migration strategy here? How are we going to help people move from where they're comfortable, which might be paper or clipboards, another application, whatever it is, to this whole new thing? And I think so. I think more effort needs to go into the people side of things, and less can go into the tech side, I think, these days, in terms of a lot of the problems. So that's what I try and really enforce with customers, is think about your people, because they are the poor bastards at the end of the day who are going to have to use this application. And if it's meeting every requirement that you've put on your document, that's great. But if they just stop using it and go back to using paper because they couldn't be bothered, well, the whole project's a failure. What was the point, right? I mean, you've paid us some money. That's great for us, but that's not why I'm in software, right? I'm not in software to make a ton of money. I'm in software to add value, right? And if we're not adding value, then I don't want to really be part of that.
I hear you. Do you find that many companies, do they involve people from, call it the just day-to-day workers, users of an application, in the creation, process building, and documentation? Are they involved, or are they just usually victims of whatever people above them decide they have to have?
We see both sides. I mean, look, I said, I've got a particular perspective, but to me, the best companies we've worked with have been the ones where it's been an integrated effort, where they've brought the right people to the table in the first place, probably even before they've selected what software to look at and that sort of thing. And they've actually discussed what the real problems are, as opposed to whatever the dashboard says they need to sort out, if you know what I mean. So they've gotten really on the ground intel and really involved that in their process from the start. I'll give you a quick story. I know time is short, but when we were in beta, we were really excited. We had a fairly large town council prospect who agreed to work with our absolutely horrible alpha beta software. It was terrible. But the person we worked with was the depot manager, and she was in charge of dispatching out road repair and road crews, right? And one of the things that they had a problem with, which you'll laugh, those huge signs you see on the side of the road with the digital signs, and they've got slow down or watch out for rocks or whatever it is, right? They were losing these signs when they went on jobs. They'd put it out on the road, and then because it was a big job or something, they wouldn't recover all of them again. They couldn't find them. I don't know how that works, but anyway, that was a core problem for them. Now, the management had no idea about this. So she built this into it. They were doing GPS location recording when they dropped the sign off and powered it up and all that. And it was great. Everything was awesome. Went through a great pilot. It got to the IT department for approval. And it turns out the IT department had been working on something similar, but they had a developer on it for 12 months. And he had produced something worse, in my opinion, than this depot manager had thrown together with our horrible alpha software in 3 hours, right? And so there was a huge political problem with that. But it just showed that disconnect, right? Is IT was like, no, this is the way we will do this. And so we lost out there. And I'm not bitter, but it's one of those enduring memories where it's like, you know what, there's the person who's actually gonna have to use whatever the hell IT produces for them. And she's just gonna have to take it, right? And it was inferior, and it taken way longer and cost way more. But it's just because they weren't talking to each other and they hadn't actually come together. And so I think good organizations are ones that have clear and really pay attention to the bubbling up of these issues from the front line, as opposed to, as I said, IT in their sort of ivory tower, just kind of doing what they want, or sales, or whoever it might be. I think that's so important.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I think we've gone through a kind of a generational change where, IT 15, 20 years ago was kind of an ivory tower, special class. And they were the only ones that really had any knowledge. And they sort of gave us all what they thought we needed. And it didn't hit the bullseye very often, right? Now we're to the point where a lot of users are pretty smart, have a lot of knowledge, and can enter those technical conversations, maybe not to the degree that our IT professionals can, but when it comes to daily experience, They really can. And there's a lot of phrases in the industry now, like customer experience, right? That people in IT have heard, and they have your frame of mind. I want to add value, right?
Yeah.
I don't know that that was on everybody's mind 20 years ago when many people entered their IT careers, right? So there's been some big changes. Well, Paul, it's been great to hear about your business. And I think it's, the whole aspect of mobility, I don't think we're done with that by any means yet. It's going to happen more and more. I think we'll watch carefully what you're doing, and people will do that who listen to the podcast as well. Thanks for joining us, and appreciate the insights. And to everyone out there, till we meet again, stay connected.